The Mariana Trench isn't a graveyard. It's the biggest library we've never opened. Imagine sinking to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. You're probably picturing total darkness, maybe a few tiny creatures, maybe nothing at all. What would actually happen is your lungs would collapse long before you got there. The pressure inside the Mariana Trench is the highest on the planet, more than 1,000 times what you feel at the surface, and no piece of military gear on Earth would save you from being crushed. So, logically, there shouldn't be much of anything alive down there, except there is. And what scientists just discovered about this place completely flips the story you've probably already heard about it. The trench didn't get its name by accident. It's named after the Mariana Islands, themselves named after a 17th century Spanish queen, and it was only formally recorded as the deepest point on the planet between 1872 and 1876, when the British survey ship HMS Challenger ran a series of rope and weight soundings across the Pacific and noticed that in one specific spot, the rope simply kept going past where it should have hit bottom. More than a century later, we still use that ship's name for the deepest point of all, the Challenger Deep. To understand the scale of the problem, you first have to understand where this thing actually starts. The Mariana Trench reaches almost 11,000 meters at its lowest point, the Challenger Deep, but that number is measured from the ocean's surface. The trench itself doesn't technically begin until around 5,000 meters down, which is its upper rim. Everything between the surface and that point is basically normal ocean, the kind of waterfish, ships, and divers cross every single day with no idea they're passing directly over the deepest spot on Earth. The scale of this is hard to process. If you flipped Mount Everest upside down and dropped it directly into the middle of this trench, the peak would still fall more than 2,000 meters short of the bottom. And that bottom is so remote that, even today, fewer people have ever stood on it than have flown to the International Space Station this year alone. And the bottom isn't even a single point. In 2019, Next Generation sonar revealed that the Challenger Deep is actually split into 3 separate basins named Western, Central, and Eastern, each one several kilometers long in its own right. Decades of expeditions had been measuring slightly different depths from each other simply because, without realizing it, they kept landing in different parts of the same hole. To get all the way down, you'd have to pass through every layer of the ocean, one at a time. But before that, here's a comparison that puts the whole problem in perspective. There are more detailed maps of the surface of the Moon and Mars than there are of the floor of our own ocean. We've pointed cameras and satellites at rocks hundreds of millions of kilometers away with more precision than we've managed for what's sitting under the water covering 70% of our own planet. The first layer is the epipelagic zone, reaching down to about 200 meters, still technically within the range a human could briefly survive, lit by just enough sunlight to still look like a normal ocean. After that comes the mesopelagic zone, often called the twilight zone, stretching to around 1,000 meters, right around where the world record for a wetsuit-free dive sits, at 214 meters, and where sunlight gets so faint that most animals down there just make their own light instead, through bioluminescence, because relying on the sun has simply stopped being worth it. From there, pressure is already 100 times what it is at the surface. Next comes the bathypelagic zone, from 1,000 to 4,000 meters, where no light reaches at all, not a single photon, the temperature sits near freezing, and the pressure is already strong enough to crush steel. And remember, technically, the Mariana Trench hasn't even started yet at this point. It's only past 4,000 meters that you enter the abyssal zone, and this is where the ocean starts playing games with scale. This is the depth range where Stygiomedusa gigantea lives, a phantom jellyfish stretching more than 10 meters across, counting its ribbon-like tentacles, which it uses not to sting but simply to wrap around anything small that drifts too close, like flypaper floating in the dark. It's been recorded in nearly every ocean on the planet except the Arctic. Yet in 100 years, there have been fewer than 100 confirmed sightings of it, which says more about how badly we've been looking than about how rare the animal actually is. Deeper in the same zone lives the bigfin squid, also known as the magnapina, a creature so rare and so deep that an adult has basically never been properly studied. Everything we know comes from juveniles, with long, elbowed arms that just hang there for no obvious reason. Almost like the creature's been left suspended in the dark, forgotten, waiting. This is usually where most videos on this topic stop telling you the truth because it's tempting to make it sound like this gigantism just keeps scaling up the deeper you go. It doesn't. The Hadal zone, starting around 6,000 meters and running to the absolute bottom, is exactly where that effect runs out of steam. Pressure there passes 1,000 times what it is at the surface, the equivalent of balancing the weight of a full-grown African elephant on every single square inch of your body. And the more body an animal has, the more surface area there is for that force to act on, and the more internal structure that can fail. Fish that rely on a swim bladder, that gas-filled sac, other fish used to control buoyancy, simply don't survive at this depth because any gas-filled space inside a body collapses long before it gets this far down. Only bodies that ditch that structure entirely make it, and that usually means small, soft bodies. Add in the near total absence of food at this depth, and you get the opposite of what the internet usually sells you. The Hadal zone isn't where the monsters get bigger. It's where deep-sea gigantism finally hits its limit. So what's actually left? Nearly transparent little fish, like the Mariana snailfish, with a body so soft it simply bends instead of breaking, and eyes so reduced they're barely functional, because there's no light down there worth seeing in the first place. Shrimp-like amphipods carrying special proteins that keep their cell membranes from collapsing under pressure, and which will eat almost anything organic that sinks down to them, including, unfortunately, microplastic that's already been found inside some of these animals, proof that not even the most isolated point on the planet escaped our garbage. And xenophyophores, giant single-celled organisms reaching up to 10 centimeters wide, building tiny shelters out of sand and minerals that work almost like ecosystem infrastructure, giving other small creatures somewhere to hide in a place with nothing else to hide behind, despite being made of a single cell. This entire food chain runs on basically one source: marine snow, flakes of dead plankton, waste, and organic dust drifting down from the surface, sometimes taking weeks just to arrive. For decades, that was pretty much the entire story science could tell about the deepest place on Earth: sparse, scattered, and essentially lifeless. But in March 2025, a study published in the journal Cell flipped that story upside down. A team led by Shanghai Jiaotong University, working with Chinese institutes and international labs, processed nearly 1,650 sediment samples collected between 6,000 and almost 11,000 meters down, in the Mariana Trench itself and in neighboring trenches like the Yap Trench and the Philippine Basin. In total, the project generated more than 92 terabytes of sequenced genetic data, a volume of information that simply hadn't existed before for this part of the planet. The result? 7,564 microbial species identified. And here's the number that actually matters. 89.4% of them were completely new to science, not rare, not understudied, unknown. All of that genetic data, by the way, was made publicly available, meaning any lab in the world can now pick up exactly where this team left off without spending a fortune organizing a brand new expedition to the same spot. And it wasn't just microorganisms. The same research documented amphipod populations thriving between 6,800 and 11,000 meters, right in the range we just described as the limit of gigantism. Except here the limit doesn't mean empty, it just means life operating at a different scale. Scientists also tested an old assumption about how fish adapt to that pressure, the idea that a compound called TMAO would keep increasing the deeper you go. Below 6,000 meters, that increase simply didn't show up. A rule textbooks have been repeating for years didn't hold up against the actual data. So the real question isn't what lives down there, it's if nearly 90% of a single batch of samples turned out to be unknown, what exactly did we think we knew about this place until now? That matters for a lot more than satisfying curiosity. Space agencies like NASA study exactly this kind of environment: dark, freezing, sunless, under extreme pressure, as the closest thing on Earth to the oceans that likely exist beneath the ice on places like Europa, a moon of Jupiter, or Enceladus, a moon of Saturn. If life can reinvent itself this thoroughly at the most hostile point on our own planet, that becomes a serious argument for the possibility of life in other oceans across the solar system, hidden completely under kilometers of ice. A lot of those samples only exist because one specific vehicle managed to get down there, the Chinese submersible Fenduje, whose name means striver, building something that can survive that pressure repeatedly, not just for one historic descent, is a massive engineering problem requiring a titanium sphere able to withstand the equivalent of dozens of elephants' worth of weight per square inch with zero margin for failure. The team ran 13 test dives before risking the full descent. In November 2020, that same submersible had already made history on its own, carrying 3 Chinese scientists to the bottom of the Challenger Deep in a live stream dive. That was just the start. Years later, it became the primary tool for collecting much of the material behind the 2025 study. And the Mariana Trench isn't even the only place like this. There are roughly 20 major ocean trenches around the world, most of them clustered in the Pacific, formed when one tectonic plate slides beneath another and tears open these deep cracks in the seafloor. The Tonga Trench and the Philippine Trench are nearly as deep as the Mariana Trench, but remain comparatively understudied, which means that even within this small, exclusive club of hostile places, the Mariana Trench is still the well-known one, and we just spent the last few minutes showing how relative that really is. But getting down there with any equipment at all was, for most of history, basically impossible. The first dive to the bottom of the Challenger Deep happened in January 1960, inside a submersible called the Trieste, piloted by Jacques Picard and Don Walsh. The descent took nearly 5 hours, slow enough for anyone inside to have plenty of time to imagine everything that could go wrong. Near the bottom, one of the outer windows cracked under the pressure, a sound neither of them expected to hear almost 11,000 meters down. They spent only 20 minutes down there before heading back up, with no way of knowing if that cracked window would hold for the entire trip to the surface. After that, nobody went back for more than 50 years. The next descent didn't happen until 2012, when James Cameron, the same director behind Titanic and Avatar, solo piloted a submersible called the Deep Sea Challenger to the same spot. He described the bottom as a completely alien landscape, flat, desolate, covered in fine sediment that looked like gray powder, with no sign of any large animal, which actually lines up with everything we just explained about the limits of gigantism at this depth. He'd planned to explore for hours, but a hydraulic leak in the sub's robotic arm forced a much faster ascent than planned, leaving most of that alien seafloor unfilmed. In 2019, investor and explorer Victor Vescovo broke that record again and did a lot more than that. He went back repeatedly over the following years, bringing other people down with him, including the first woman ever to visit the deepest point on the planet. That same expedition made him the first person in history to visit the deepest point of all 5 of the world's oceans, a project called the 5 Deeps. It was only through those repeated trips that scientists managed to map the floor of the Challenger Deep in more detail than at any other point in history. Even so, adding it all up, fewer people have ever stood down there than have flown to space this year alone. Most of what we actually know, though, doesn't come from humans going down there in person. It comes from remote and autonomous vehicles. And that part of the story is changing fast. Organizations like NOAA and the Ocean Exploration Trust have, just in the last few seasons, been operating autonomous vehicles like Orpheus, capable of mapping the seafloor without an operator controlling every single move in real time, diving repeatedly into areas no human has ever personally visited. At the same time, research teams are training AI systems fed by underwater image databases built specifically for this purpose to identify and classify animals automatically in the footage these cameras capture, processing in hours a volume of video that would take one person years to review by hand. It's the difference between waiting decades to catalog a single expedition and getting results in something close to real time. And it's not just scientific curiosity driving these expeditions. The floor of the Mariana Trench also holds polymetallic nodules, mineral deposits that have drawn growing commercial interest. The same autonomous vehicles documenting this explosion of new species are also being used to map exactly where those minerals sit, which means science and commercial exploration are, at the same time, eyeing the exact same stretch of largely unexplored seafloor, and that creates real tension. Several scientists and governments have called for any deep-sea mining to wait until there's more research, precisely because we're still cataloging species that might only exist in that specific layer of sediment. Other countries and companies argue that demand for these minerals used in batteries and technology can't wait decades for study to catch up. That debate is far from settled, but the 2025 study left one thing hard to ignore. We're risking commercially exploiting a place before we've even finished discovering what actually lives in it. So, here's everything we actually know, put together. The Mariana Trench isn't the empty graveyard most videos describe. It's a place where gigantism genuinely hits a physical limit. That part's true, but where life simply shifts scale instead of disappearing, and where nearly 9 out of 10 species found in one recent expedition were, until very recently, completely unknown to science. We spent more than a century treating this place as the edge of the map, the point where life gives up. It took decades just to manage a second visit after that first dive in 1960. And even so, it took just one recent expedition with the right equipment to reveal that we've been looking in the wrong way the entire time, seeing empty space where there was actually just life that hadn't been named yet. If one batch of samples revealed all that, it's worth asking, how many other layers of this story still don't even have a question attached to them? And how much longer are we going to keep calling a place empty when we've simply never looked at it properly?